When we think of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., one powerful image usually comes to mind, right? The dreamer. The man on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, painting this incredible picture of a future where race doesn't divide us. And that is such a vital, foundational part of his legacy. But what if that was only half the story? Today we're diving into the other, more radical part of that dream, the one that, for the most part, has been forgotten.
This is it. This is the quote we all know, the one etched into our history books and our hearts. And it's absolutely right to remember him this way, as the amazing leader of the civil rights movement, the champion for desegregation and voting rights. I mean, those were monumental, world-changing achievements.
But what if I told you that in King's own view, that dream of racial harmony was literally impossible without a complete, fundamental restructuring of the entire American economy? That's the big question we're getting into today as we look at a side of Dr. King that often gets left out of the conversation.
To really understand this other dream, we have to go back in time, way before the March on Washington, actually, to a private letter that kind of changes everything, revealing the real foundation of his worldview.
See, there's this common misconception that Dr. King's focus on poverty and economic justice was a late addition to his work. Something he turned to only in his final years. But the historical record? It tells a completely different story. His radical economic critique was there from the very, very beginning.
This timeline really puts it all into perspective. The private letter we're about to look at was written in 1952. That's a full 11 years before his iconic speech in Washington. So this wasn't some late career shift. This was a core belief he held for over a decade before he ever became a household name.
And here it is, in his own words, writing to his future wife, Coretta Scott. It's just so direct. He says flat out that he's more socialistic than capitalistic. Why? Because he believes capitalism creates a system that takes necessities from the masses to give luxuries to the classes. This private conviction would basically become the bedrock of his public work for the rest of his life.
So, you might be wondering, why isn't this side of King more famous? Well, you have to remember the time he was living in, the Cold War. Being called a communist in the 1950s and 60s was a political death sentence, and King knew that. So while his private beliefs were crystal clear, he had to be really careful with his public language, often using phrases like economic justice when he was really talking about something much closer to socialism.
But it is so crucial to understand this wasn't just a political opinion for Dr. King. His economic critique was deeply, deeply rooted in his moral and theological training. So let's explore the why behind what he believed. King's way of thinking was this incredible blend of several powerful ideas. The social gospel taught him that faith demanded action against social evils like poverty. Personalism, which was his focus in his doctorate, insisted that every single human being has infinite value. He also pulled from Hegelian dialectics, this idea of finding a higher synthesis between two opposing ideas, and the biblical prophets, who were always calling for justice and redistributing wealth. For him, these weren't just academic concepts, they were the moral engine driving his work.
To explain this moral failure, King used a really powerful term, thingify. He argued that the great sin of both racism and unchecked capitalism was that they thingified people. They turned human beings, who have this divine spark of personality, into objects, things to be used and thrown away for economic gain.
And this quote just connects all the dots so brilliantly. For King, racism wasn't just about prejudice. It was the permission slip that allowed the economic system to thingify black people, which then justified exploiting them. The moral sin and the economic injustice were really just two sides of the same coin.
So as his thinking developed, Dr. King started to talk more publicly about how all these things were connected. He framed the problems in American society not as separate issues, but as what he called the triple evils. He argued that racism, materialism, and by that he meant economic exploitation, and militarism weren't three separate problems. No, they were a single vicious cycle. You couldn't fix one without taking on the other two. To put it simply, racism was the justification, materialism was the motive, and militarism was the must.
This table here breaks it down with real-world examples from his time. You had Jim Crow laws, a clear manifestation of racism, used to divide workers and justify paying people less. Slum ownership was materialism in action, putting profits way ahead of decent housing. And the Vietnam War was militarism, protecting corporate interests overseas.
King's opposition to the Vietnam War was one of his most controversial positions, but it made perfect sense if you followed his logic. He saw the war as a moral and economic disaster.
He called it a demonic, destructive suction tube that was pulling billions of dollars and hundreds of thousands of young men, disproportionately poor and black, out of their communities and sending them to die for liberties overseas that they didn't even have back home.
But here's the thing about Dr. King. He wasn't just a critic. He spent the last years of his life putting together a concrete, detailed blueprint for how to actually restructure American society to get to that real justice for everyone. One of his most powerful arguments was when he exposed what he saw as the central hypocrisy of the American economy. He pointed out that, hey, the government has no problem giving out massive subsidies, tax breaks, and bailouts for wealthy corporations and farmers. He called it a kind of socialism for the rich. But when it came to the poor, the message was always, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps.
So, to fix this hypocrisy, he pushed for 3 big, interconnected pillars of policy. These weren't just vague ideas. They were specific, practical programs designed to completely wipe out poverty in the wealthiest nation on Earth, once and for all.
The cornerstone was something called the Freedom Budget, a huge 10-year plan. It called for an investment of $185 billion. That's over $1.5 trillion in today's money. This wasn't a handout. It was a massive investment in public works, a federal job guarantee, universal health care. The goal was simple but audacious: achieve full employment and end poverty in a decade.
In the final months of his life, he pulled all these ideas together and called for an economic bill of rights. He argued that, hey, political freedom is pretty meaningless if you don't have economic security. His vision was huge, demanding a right to a living wage job, a guaranteed income to eliminate poverty, affordable housing, comprehensive healthcare, and education. This was the dream he was fighting for when he was killed.
So, what was the ultimate goal of all of this? I mean, these economic proposals and critiques of capitalism, they weren't the end goal in themselves. They were all in service of one final, profound vision he called the beloved community.
The beloved community wasn't some sentimental, utopian fantasy. For King, it was a practical and achievable goal. It was a society where our systems actually encouraged us to cooperate instead of compete, where every single person's dignity was honored and where everyone had what they needed to thrive. And for him, that was just impossible under a system that he believed put profits over people.
Now, King rejected the totalitarianism of Soviet communism just as fiercely as he critiqued the injustices of American capitalism. He was always searching for a third way, a higher synthesis. He believed in a democratic socialism that would protect our individual freedoms while also making sure we had a collective responsibility for everyone's well-being.
And all this leaves us with a final and pretty challenging question. Dr. King himself said that the struggles for racial equality and economic justice were inseparable. So if we really want to honor his full legacy, is it enough to just remember the dream of 1963? Or do we also have to confront his deeper, more radical dream for economic justice, a dream that remains, for now, unfulfilled?